he fills stadiums with waltzes. Not arenas built for orchestra's football stadiums, the kind built for 60,000 people screaming for a different kind of music entirely. André Rieu has sold more concert tickets in the past 2 decades than almost any touring musician alive, classical or otherwise. He has performed for crowds in the hundreds of thousands in a single outdoor concert in his hometown of Maastricht. He has made Johann Strauss, the 19th century king of the Viennese waltz, into one of the most commercially successful brands in contemporary live entertainment. He did this by being told, repeatedly and with considerable institutional confidence, that what he wanted to do could not be done. The classical music establishment, the conservatories, the critics, the keepers of the tradition who decide what counts as serious music and what counts as spectacle, told André Rieu for the better part of 2 decades that he was debasing an art form, that the costumes and the chandeliers and the dancing audiences and the sheer scale of the production were a betrayal of everything classical music was supposed to be. He built an empire on the rejection. Have you ever been told by the people whose approval mattered most to you that the thing you loved most was something you were doing wrong and found, eventually, that the love itself was the only authority you actually needed? That is the story underneath André Rieu's waltzes. And it began, like most stories about defying an institution, with a father who represented everything the institution stood for. It is 1994. Maastricht, the Netherlands. André Rieu has just formed his own orchestra, the Johann Strauss Orchestra, after years of frustration with the rigid formality of conventional classical performance. He is 44 years old. He has spent his entire adult life inside conservatories and orchestras that operate by a code of behavior so strict it borders on liturgical. The audience sits in silence, claps only between movements, dresses formally, and receives the music as something to be respected from a careful distance. He has watched this code for decades drive away exactly the people the music was originally written for. He has decided this is wrong, not wrong as music, wrong as an experience. He believes, with a conviction that the classical establishment finds genuinely threatening, that the waltz was never meant to be received in silence. It was meant to be danced to. It was party music, ballroom music, music written for people in motion, in love, in champagne-soaked celebration, and somewhere across a century of institutional ossification, it had been embalmed into something that required permission to enjoy. He starts small. Local concerts, an orchestra dressed not in formal black, but an elaborate period costume. An audience invited explicitly to clap whenever they feel like it, to dance if the mood strikes them, to experience the music the way the people who first heard it actually experienced it. The classical press is appalled. The audiences are not. This story does not begin in 1994. It begins in Maastricht decades earlier, in the home of a man who believed there was exactly one correct way to make music and who built, without intending to, the rebellion that would eventually outgrow him completely. André Rieu was born on October 1, 1949, in Maastricht, in a family where music was not a passion, but a profession governed by exacting standards. His father, André Rieu Sr., was a respected conductor, disciplined, formal, devoted to the strict interpretive traditions of European classical performance. He led regional orchestras with a meticulousness that left little room for deviation, and he raised his children inside a household that ran on rehearsal schedules and technical precision. Music was serious. Music was correct. Music was something you approached with the reverence due to an institution far larger than yourself. Young André began violin lessons at 5. He was talented genuinely, observably talented, and he absorbed his father's seriousness about craft even as he began, almost from childhood, to notice something his father's tradition did not seem to value: the audience's joy. He noticed that the music his father considered the most serious and important produced the least visible pleasure in the people listening to it, and that the people seemed happiest, most alive, most moved, during the unguarded moments when a piece had momentum, melody, the unmistakable physical pull of something that wanted bodies to move. He trained at the Liege Conservatory and the Maastricht Conservatory, working through the demanding technical curriculum that European conservatory training requires. The years of scales and repertoire and competitive performance that produce, when they work, a violinist capable of the precision the tradition demands. He became, by every conventional metric, a serious and accomplished violinist, fully credentialed inside the institution his father represented. He also never stopped noticing the gap between what the institution valued and what actually moved people. He would watch, during the formal concerts he performed in as a young professional, an audience sitting in careful, respectful, almost anxious silence, afraid to clap at the wrong moment, afraid to show too much feeling, afraid of violating a code of behavior that had nothing to do with the music itself and everything to do with what the institution had decided counted as appropriate reception. He wanted something different for the people listening. He didn't yet have the standing, the confidence, or the model to build it. Have you ever inherited a tradition from someone you loved and respected only to discover, slowly and with real discomfort, that the tradition itself didn't contain the thing you were actually looking for? That gap between his father's exacting formalism and his own growing conviction that music's purpose was joy, not reverence, is where André Rieu's entire career began. For years he played the role the conservatory had built him for. He performed in string quartets. He gave formal recitals. He founded the Maastricht Salon Orchestra in the 1970s, experimenting in small ways with lighter repertoire, but largely operating within the boundaries the institution had drawn. He did the things a classically trained violinist from a respected musical family was supposed to do. He was good at it. He was also, by his own later admission, quietly miserable in the specific way of someone executing a script written by someone else. The turning point came not from a single dramatic rupture, but from a slow accumulation of small experiments. He started performing waltzes, actual 19th century Viennese waltzes, the dance music of Johann Strauss, in informal settings, watching what happened to audiences who were given permission to actually enjoy themselves rather than perform the appropriate silence of classical concert etiquette. What happened was electric. People who had never attended a classical concert in their lives were moved to tears by music they assumed they wouldn't understand. People danced in the aisles. The formality that the conservatory insisted was necessary for the music to be taken seriously turned out to be, in practice, the very thing preventing most people from accessing it at all. He founded the Johann Strauss Orchestra in 1987, and by the mid-1990s had committed fully to the model that would define the rest of his career: full-period costuming, elaborate staging, massive scale, and an explicit invitation for the audience to respond however moved them. He brought ballroom dancers onto the stage. He performed outdoors in public squares for free, to crowds that grew from hundreds to tens of thousands to eventually more than 100,000 people gathered in Maastricht's Vrijthof Square for a single concert. The classical music establishment did not receive this well. Critics accused him of turning serious art into kitsch. Conservatory colleagues distanced themselves. He was, for years, treated by the institution he had been raised inside as an embarrassment, someone who had taken a genuinely important tradition and commercialized it into spectacle for people who didn't understand what they were watching. He kept going anyway. Have you ever had to choose between the respect of the institution that trained you and the genuine, unmanufactured joy of the people you were actually trying to reach? That choice, made publicly, made repeatedly, made in the face of real professional cost, is the central test of André Rieu's career, and he never wavered on which side he was choosing. The cost of that choice was real. For more than a decade, André Rieu was treated by significant parts of the European classical establishment as a punchline rather than appear a serious violinist who had, in their estimation, sold his training for spectacle. Orchestras he had once performed alongside distanced themselves from his projects. Critics in major European publications wrote about him with a specific contempt usually reserved for performers seen as actively damaging to the art form's reputation rather than merely commercially successful within it. He has spoken about this period with more candor than the relentlessly cheerful public persona usually allows through. He has described the specific loneliness of being excluded from a world he had spent his entire life training to belong to, of watching former colleagues treat his success as evidence of failure rather than achievement, of building something genuinely significant while being told, by the only authorities who had ever mattered to him, that it didn't count. He also never stopped believing his father's tradition had gotten something fundamentally wrong, and the contradiction between loving the music he'd inherited and rejecting the way it had been taught to him was not something he ever fully resolved. He has said in later interviews that he still feels the pull of his father's seriousness, even as he has spent 40 years building something his father's generation would have found close to sacrilegious. His father, by most accounts, never fully reconciled himself to what his son had built, even as the commercial evidence of its success became impossible to ignore. That tension love for the tradition, rejection of its gatekeeping, never went away. It simply stopped being the thing that determined his choices. What André Rieu built in spite of the rejection is, by any commercial measure, one of the most successful classical music enterprises in modern history. The Johann Strauss Orchestra has performed for tens of millions of people across more than 30 countries. His outdoor concerts in Maastricht regularly draw crowds well over 100,000, a scale of live audience that most touring orchestras, classical or otherwise, will never approach in their entire careers. He has sold more than 40 million records. He has been recognized by Billboard as one of the most successful touring artists in any genre, classical or otherwise, repeatedly outselling pop and rock acts that the industry considers far more commercially viable than waltz orchestras. He achieved all of this by refusing the central premise of the institution that trained him, that seriousness requires distance, that respect requires formality, that the audience's joy is somehow beneath the dignity of the music being performed. The central irony of André Rieu's career is precise. The man trained from childhood inside one of the most rigid traditions in European music became commercially successful, specifically by dismantling the rigidity by insisting, against the considered judgment of every institution that had shaped him, that the music his father taught him to revere was always meant to make people dance. He was not wrong about the music. He was simply right about something the institution had forgotten. In 2026, André Rieu is 76 years old. He continues to tour internationally with the Johann Strauss Orchestra, performing to sold-out arenas and stadiums across Europe, North America, Australia, and Asia. He still performs his annual outdoor concert in Maastricht's Vrijthof Square, now one of the most significant classical music events in the world by attendance, drawing audiences far larger than most major orchestras will ever play to in a single decade. The classical establishment's posture toward him has softened considerably over the decades as the scale of his audience became impossible to dismiss as merely commercial, and as a younger generation of classical musicians began to credit him, openly, with introducing them to the genre in the first place. He has, without ever seeking the establishment's approval, become one of the primary reasons classical music has any meaningful presence in mainstream popular culture at all. Documentary filmmakers and music historians now treat his model as a genuinely significant intervention in how classical performance can function commercially, rather than as the embarrassment earlier critics insisted it was. He still performs in the elaborate period costuming, still invites his audiences to clap and dance and respond however they're moved, still treats every performance as an explicit rejection of the idea that serious music requires a serious face. There is something quietly vindicating about that image, a man who spent the first half of his career being told by every authority that mattered to him that he had gotten it all wrong, who simply kept playing the music the way he believed it was always meant to be played, and who built, in the rejection, one of the largest classical music audiences the world has ever seen. André Rieu's story is not a story about waltzes. It is a story about what it costs to trust your own instinct about what something is for, even when the people who trained you insist you're wrong. About the specific courage required to keep building something genuinely joyful while an entire institution treats your success as evidence of your failure. What have you been told you're doing wrong by people whose judgment you respected, whose approval you wanted, that you've quietly kept doing anyway, because some part of you trusted the joy more than the criticism? Leave that in the comments. Because that question isn't about classical music. It's about every time you've had to choose between being taken seriously and being genuinely happy. If this story moved something in, you leave a like. It costs nothing, and it means this reaches someone who needs the reminder. Subscribe. More stories like this are coming. People who built something real while the experts insisted they were wrong. And tell me in the comments, what's the one thing from André Rieu's story you're taking with you? Because the most important thing he ever conducted wasn't an orchestra. It was the decision, made over and over for 30 years, to trust the dancing over the disapproval. We'll be back.